Readers, listeners, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, I am so pleased to be sitting down to talk with you about The Correspondent by Virginia Evans. This is a book that has gotten a lot of attention recently. Virginia Evans has been doing like a full complement of interviews. There's lots to listen to online, but people are mostly talking about the phenomenon of the book and not so much why it is that it is working so well. I will admit that this is a book that was given to me by a very close friend and a very smart reader, and I was very excited to dive in. Although I had my reservations because I'm not someone who loves the epistolary novel. The epistolary novel is simply a novel told in letters. It is not my favorite genre, but again, this is a wise reader friend. I was like, okay, I'm going to take a look at this. Then I opened it, and honestly, it was so sad right from the start that I actually had to put it down. I had to reapproach it. I do not think this is the experience most people are having with this book. But it just goes to show, A, the power of literature, and also the power of our experience of a book depending on when we come to it and what is happening in our lives. And we are not going to discuss spoilers today, so feel free, to listen to this with abandon. But very early in the novel, there is that part where we are introduced, fairly early on, to two of Sybil's children, Fiona and Bruce. We think those are all of the children. And then at one point she mentions having raised 3 children. And I honestly was like, oh my God, I can't do it. I'm not in a place where I can do this. I'm not sure why that, I know why that hit me hard. This is not a topic that would ever be easy for me to read. But I will also tell you that wise and smart friend has actually had the experience of losing a child. So I was like, if she can read this book and find solace and merit in it, then I think I also can steel myself and get back in there. I found myself really deeply saddened by the loss of Sybil's child, but I also found myself really fixated on this idea of aging and mortality. I am 56, but my dad is in his mid-80s, and I think a lot of us who are my age are facing this idea of aging parents, which of course makes you look at your own mortality. There was something about the decline of Sybil that just really, really was difficult for me. So this kind of sadness and this weariness about, not weariness, but this worrying about mortality, those were 2 reasons why I put it aside. I did pick it back up, and I am so glad that I did. So for those of you who like an agenda, what we're going to do today is talk very quickly about Virginia Evans, a couple of remarks that she made in an interview that were really very enlightening for me. We're then going to talk about the epistolary novel, the ways that it has not worked in the past for me. A couple of examples of that. I'm sure you will know a few of them. Sometimes people are not even aware that a novel is told in letters. And it's always really interesting to me when that is kind of a more conspicuous thing than others. So we'll talk a bit about that. We're then going to talk about the narrative voice and the audiobook. This was an audiobook. I oftentimes will toggle back and forth between a physical book and an audiobook. This, I think probably a lot of people liked the audiobook. It did not do a lot for me, and I'm going to discuss why. I'm then going to talk about some very quick quibbles and then end with the deep appeal of the book. Okay, so first we're going to talk about Virginia Evans. I'm not going to do a whole deep bio thing about her, but some of these points that she made recently in an interview were really interesting to me. The first and foremost, the crazy thing that I just was oh my Lord, is that she actually got to work with Claire Keegan. So at one point when her children were young, they the whole family decamped to Ireland. But the idea, and she worked with other amazing people at Trinity, but the idea of working with Claire Keegan on this, it was just was so impressed and really loved the idea of having Claire's kind of eye on this text. There's a way in which an epistolary novel can function a little bit like a short story sort of thing, because each chapter, well, there I go. It's not a chapter, actually. It's a story in a story collection, or it is a letter in an epistolary novel, but each one of these letters can function a bit like a short story. So in some ways it makes a lot of sense to me that someone like Claire Keegan would be an incredible resource. I don't know how closely they worked together, but honestly, I just was green with envy. I'm not even a writer anymore, but I'm on the newsletter kind of thing. And whenever Claire Keegan has a workshop, every once in a while she'll do a workshop, and I'm literally always oh my God, I should just go. I should just go and pretend I'm a writer just so that I can be in that woman's orbit. So she mentioned that she had spent some time at Trinity College in Dublin and had studied with Claire Keegan. She also mentioned the fact that between the ages of 19 and 39, she had written 8 novels. Not for any of you out there who are literally trying to accomplish anything, this should be very inspirational for you. She, at one point, Gilbert Cruz, I was listening to the interview that Gilbert Cruz did with her. This is where all of this information is coming from. But at one point, he was like, Virginia, did it ever occur to you that maybe you should stop writing novels? Which actually was interesting for me. I am someone, I published a nonfiction book, but my dream was always to write a novel. And I don't know, I honestly lost track. It might be 4, it might be 5 novels. And at some point, I'm actually very happy that I was able to just say, you know what, I just don't think this is the thing for me. And it was such a relief. Part of me, I'm very happy that Virginia Evans persevered, but wow, was it great. I just climbed right back over the desk and got to the professorial side of the whole thing and dug back into literature from a place where I'm very comfortable instead of agonizing over the idea of trying to write fiction. So it's this very inspirational thing where she also talked about having sent her novel manuscripts to zillions of different agents and never getting one. Her agent is in Toronto. She loves her agent, but she couldn't find anyone in New York. They tried to sell a bunch of different things. It didn't work. And then finally has really, really worked with this book. So let her be a testament and an example for perseverance. She also talked a lot just about the concept of letter writing. She has always been a letter writer. I was born in 1969, and I do remember this. I have a gigantic bin in my basement that is full of letters. I actually don't look at them very often. I'm not a very nostalgic person, but oh my God, there was nothing like sitting down and writing a letter. Remember those air post things if you were in Europe? There were those light blue things that you had to write all over them and then fold them up in this very intricate way. Just the feel, the sense memory of that kind of thing is so lovely. But she did talk about this idea of there's nothing better than opening up your mailbox and seeing that you have an actual letter written to you from an actual person. And I 100% agree with that. She made a point that she was not someone who had to write a lot of thank you notes. She was saying that she hadn't grown up in the South. And I promise that we will get to this book and I will stop digressing. But I grew up in California, Northern California, very relaxed kind of household. But we were made to write a lot of thank you notes. And I, in fact, insisted that my children write thank you notes. But somehow I would always kind of lose the thread on these things. And at one point, my older son is born in October. And I think around Christmas time, I found these thank you notes that he had written for birthday gifts. And I just had never gotten them in the mail. And I died because one of them was Dear Grandma, thank you very much for the birthday money. I plan on using it for Christmas presents for everyone else. And I thought that was so funny. My mother-in-law actually did not think it was that funny. But the other one that he had written was also to my husband's family. It was to my brother and sister-in-law. And he was Dear Uncle Tim and Aunt Kara, thank you so much for giving me the mythology board game. It looks great, but no one in my family will play it with me, so I'm not entirely sure. So, those are not the basis of any kind of epistolary novel, but I do mourn the loss of letters. Those are hilarious little notes. And there's something about, seeing the handwriting and seeing the goofy little card that it was written on that's deeply moving in some way. And that is certainly something we have lost. But moving along here, Virginia Evans also mentioned in the interview with Gilbert Cruz that Sybil arrived to her all at once, just sort of appeared. And the two things that she knew right away about Sybil were that she had had a really hardcore career and that she had lost a child. Evans also mentioned in this same interview, although she did not link these two things together, she did not link Sybil's career in the law with this fact, but she did say that at some point, she always knew that she would maybe be writing, but she felt like she wanted a work life that was more kind of focused and maybe more lucrative. And so she was looking into going to law school. So my sense is if that was happening at all around the time of when Sybil popped into her life, that maybe her own, examination of law school colored the fact that Sybil has this law career. She did not mention in the interview a fact that she mentions in the acknowledgement that seemed incredibly important to me. She, right at the top of the acknowledgements, she mentions that, she calls them dear family friends, that over the course of just a few months, they had a 6-year-old child who got sick and who died, and how it was just, obviously it would be just deeply, deeply sad. And she was really carrying a lot of that grief. And I can kind of imagine that's not the thing that you would just be mentioning in what was in other ways a very kind of light interview. It was really interesting, but she was really enjoying herself. I think that would have been very difficult to introduce something that dark. But the thing that she did say, which also completely freaked me out, is that her own son was 8 years old when she was writing The Correspondent. And every single time she sat down to write a letter from Sybil to someone else, even if it had nothing to do with the death of her own child, the death of Sybil's child, Evans would always have in the back of her mind the image of her own son and the loss of her own son. I'm honestly like, I mean, I'm not a super superstitious person. I'm a tiny superstitious person, but I do have, I mean, I don't mess around, with that kind of mortality. And I just was like, oh my God, how could she do that? I mean, it certainly would lend some gravitas to the novel, but I think that would be unbearable. Honestly, that was a very impressive and surprising move that really that her own 8-year-old son was very much, at the center in some ways of her imagining of Sybil. Also, I'm just going to note at the bottom of the acknowledgments, she has a Bible verse. It's James, I don't know how you say this. It's James 1:10. And I looked it up. I imagine though lots of you did not in fact go and look up the Bible verse that she put at the end of the acknowledgments. She thanked her husband in the final paragraph in a very sweet way, and then she simply put James 1:10. And my AI thing on my telephone here is saying that that Bible verse reads, "The rich should glory in their humiliation, finding their pride not in wealth, but in their spiritual lowliness before God." Which is so interesting to me. I'm kind of fascinated by that in general. Okay, I now want to dive into the book itself. For those of you who are new to the Foxed page, you know that the whole thing in terms of getting a richer experience of your reading is simply to pay closer attention. One thing you want to focus on always is the title. I really like the title of this book. And when you think about what it, could have been a lot of things. It could have been the letter writer, but the correspondent in many ways is a little more formal. And I think it's really apt where Sybil is concerned. I mean, she is the woman, she is the correspondent that is, the subject of that title. And I think it's a nice nod to her professionalism. It's a nice nod perhaps to her career. It's also this nice idea of just putting emphasis on the fact that this is an epistolary book, that letters are really, in many ways, the lifeblood of this book. And the idea of being able to relate deeply with people in a way that's not email and it's not even voice stuff. It's like, having an artifact, having a piece of paper that has someone's, handwriting on it. Which I'm going to get a little later to the way that this book is formatted with different fonts and whatnot, and we'll just discuss the success of that then. But in terms of the title, I really do like the idea of the correspondent. I also really loved the idea of corresponding as like kind of in geometrical terms or in psychological terms, this idea of co-responding, the idea of responding to something together with someone else, kind of co-regulating. You have this idea of co-responding, which I think is just a very beautiful sentiment. I also, we're discussing the correspondent here. I like the cover art fine. For some reason, it kept reminding me of the Goldfinch. I think just because you have that white book with a bird on it. I didn't love this. I also feel like it made it feel a little lighter than it could have been. I'm not sure. I felt like the cover was fine. I didn't absolutely love it. Importantly, there is a blurb by Ann Patchett, and in that interview, Virginia Evans did talk about the fact that she had a nice correspondence with Ann Patchett. She is someone who, again, a real letter writer, and she wrote to Ann Patchett, and Ann Patchett was writing back and forth. She mentioned that her agent, or maybe it was her editor, someone asked Ann Patchett to blurb the book, that Virginia herself didn't want to call in a favor, which I think is very noble. There we go. There's that humility, maybe. But the blurb that they have on the front is "a cause for celebration," which is apt in some ways, but honestly, I found this book deeply sad. So I felt like that actually was a tiny bit misleading. Okay, so we open up the book, and what we find in the beginning is an epigraph, and it's from Joan Didion. It's from the White Album. There is actually a lecture on the White Album if you are interested in that. I am a huge Joan Didion fan. We can also get out of the way right from the top here. Virginia herself mentioned in the review that it felt very, very bold to her, that she was envisioning this idea of writing in Joan Didion's own voice. And I was actually very happy to have Virginia say that and kind of acknowledge that this was this bold thing she was doing. Because I just was a little, I don't know. I was would Joan Didion write back? I actually wanted to know if she kept correspondence with, fans who wrote to her. She is so incredibly mythic in my mind, Joan Didion. And in many ways, she seems so kind of private and reticent and weirdly legendary. I just can't. She just does not seem like someone who would ever write a letter to a fan, which is maybe completely wrong. I should have looked that up beforehand. I did not look that up beforehand. Also, I just adjusted my sweater. Anyone who's on YouTube and is wondering if I made this sweater, I did, in fact. And if you are wondering how I made that little square neckline, that's happening here. It's gray and blue stripes, but it has like somehow has a square neckline. I have no idea. I got like a t-shirt recipe, a pattern off of the internet, and something about how I made these raglan sleeves gave it like this crazy square neckline. But back to the epigraph. And in terms of this idea of Joan Didion writing back, I'm actually someone who was a huge letter writer. I wrote to lots of authors, and I was always shocked by how many wrote back to me. So I guess I should not be surprised. I had 2 different postcards back from David Foster Wallace. Those are probably like my most cherished of all of the letters that I got back. I will also say, do you remember Chuck Palahniuk? He wrote Fight Club. I'm sure you remember that. I was obsessed with his writing for a while, and I sent him a fan letter. And you guys, these letters were like, I would do like a tiny like term paper. There was like lots of analysis because I really wanted to prove to these people that I was like a true fan. And so I wrote to Chuck Palahniuk, and he sent back this entire like care package, and it had a couple of copies of his books, and like tucked into the books was like a forget-me-not, a packet of forget-me-not seeds. And I was writing at the time, and so he sent me these kind of gaudy like costume earrings that I was supposed to wear when I was writing. And I was so freaked out because I was like, oh my God, I am being stalked by Chuck Palahniuk. Like I just was like, and this was before the internet. But at the time, my older brother was selling rare books, and he was in Los Angeles, and he knew a lot of people in that world. And he's like, no. He's like, Chuck, right? He has like some person who every time he gets a fan letter, the person puts together like a whole care package and sends them off to people, which was both like amazing to me and also such a relief because I truly was like, oh my God, I wrote such a great letter that suddenly Chuck Palahniuk is stalking me. All of which is to say that perhaps I should just pipe down and just let Virginia Evans go ahead and inhabit Joan Didion's mind. I think part of it too, like I did not strike up like full correspondence with these people. It was not, they did not care about my life, and we did not correspond back and forth and back and forth. This was like a fan letter to them, and they would usually send something back, usually not a care package, but something very appreciative, and that was great. So maybe it's more like the correspondence back and forth with Joan Didion that seemed surprising to me. Although it did sound like Virginia Evans had that with Ann Patchett, so, there you go. So here, finally, is what we have for this epigraph by Joan Didion. It's, again, from the White Album. What I have made for myself is personal, but it is not exactly peace. Most of us live less theatrically, but remain the survivors of a peculiar and inward time. Joan Didion, on the morning after the 60s. I really loved this. I love the idea of framing with something that is actually Joan Didion's words. And I love this idea of like an inward time and this question of like peace and this question of art as allowing us to have some sort of consolation or peace or understanding. I thought the epigraph was great. And we are not going to go like deeply through, this is not going to be like a close reading of this novel, because in many ways the prose is not, it's not the like quality of this prose that is really the most impressive thing of this book. A lot of it has to do with voice, and it has to do with structure, and it has to do with this kind of this not gimmick, but this tool that she is using with these different letters and different voices. The prose itself is great, but it's not sort of the emphasis of the book. But in the very beginning, and you might have forgotten this, we have a preface. And obviously in an epistolary novel, you don't have a standard narrator. There's not someone who's kind of stitching all of these letters together. But in this case, we do have a preface. And it's always so fascinating to finish a book and go back to the beginning and look at the beginning again. So I'm going to read just like a couple of chunks of this preface to you, because it really is a very beautiful thing, and it reads very differently from the rest of it. And there is a lyrical quality to this. There's like a sense of the prose here as being a little bit elevated in this interesting way, although she's describing something kind of very mundane. So we're going to just read quickly here through a little bit of this preface. At last, on Monday around 10 or half past, Sybil Van Antwerp carries the mug of Irish breakfast tea with milk to her desk. Irish breakfast there makes sense to me because she did a lot of this in Trinity. So then she has a little description of the bed's made and the dishes are drying. And then she has a description of her garden and looking out at Annapolis through the window where her desk is located. And then we have this. With satisfaction, she straightens the stack of letter-writing paper and the short, always turning over pile of books she will read next. She arranges the pens in the mug. She counts her stamps. She consults the stack of what letters she has received and not yet answered. A list she keeps of letters she means to write, a stack of upside-down pages in the drawer, a letter she has been writing going on years now, still unsent. So that's a nod, of course, to the letter that she is writing. That is one of the main kind of through lines of the book, and it's really beautifully done, and I think it added a lot of tension. Of course, at this point, I mean, everyone should be paying attention at the beginning here because she's setting up a lot of expectation and she's showing us where we should be kind of focusing our attention. But I think a lot of people kind of, you move over that. So, but it is interesting to note that at the end of this preface, where the momentum is moving toward the idea of this letter that is unsent. And then we have this description. Sybil is a mother and grandmother, divorced, retired from a distinguished career in law. These things are all there around her, but it is this correspondence. On Wednesday it is the same, and on Friday, and on Saturday. On Monday, around 10 or half past, Sybil Van Antwerp sits down at her desk again. It is the correspondence that is her manner of living. So a couple of quick notes here. So she has this idea that there's a lot of stuff about her life, and it says, but this correspondence, and then she breaks off with an M dash and has a new paragraph. On Wednesday it is the same, new paragraph, and on Friday, new paragraph, and on Saturday, and then on Monday, around 10 or half past, she sits down at the desk again. And then we have that last part about what the correspondence actually is. And this kind of like lyrical kind of breaking off here, in some ways I liked it, but in some ways it was like setting up this idea that this book was going to be a bit more sort of stylistically interesting than it ended up being for me. And whenever you have like a preface or a foreword, or, I mean, I think most people will read this. I don't think tons of people are skipping right over it. It used to be a thing, you'd skip over the introduction because it would be a lot of spoilers and it would be some historical thing written by someone. Mostly that would be with a classic. But I still would stand by the idea that I'm not entirely sure that this preface was necessary. All of these things are things that we learn. And in some ways it felt a little bit elevated in a way that wasn't entirely successful for me. And it also raised my expectation for the kind of prose we were going to find. And it didn't quite match. It feels to me like something that she maybe wrote at the very beginning of the book or maybe after she finished. In some ways it isn't quite in sync with the rest of the book. I didn't not like it, but I'm not sure it's adding a ton. Okay, so then of course we dive from this preface into all of these different letters, which is a great segue into my reservations about the epistolary novel. So the epistolary, it's a genre actually that has been around for a zillion years. Like we have Renaissance literature, we have a lot of different examples of it. 1782 was the publication of Dangerous Liaisons by Laclos. It's a French book. Most of you probably know the movie. I think it's Daniel Day-Lewis and Michelle Pfeiffer. But that is a book that is it's letters back and forth between the two of them. That is a book for me that was not entirely successful. So you can understand the limitations of an epistolary novel. We have one person who is describing their own experience, and they're sending something to one other person. So you have this very specific kind of like relationship, this very specific context, and like a lot of parameters. Like, if you're writing a letter to your grandmother, if it's the entire thing is built on that, you're not gonna be writing about like your torrid sex that you're having somewhere. So it's like you're limited by not only the fact that we have this first person narrator, usually a couple of them, but then also whatever that first person is saying, it's restrained by the fact that they are talking to one person. The other thing that happens is like if you have to give backstory or you have to explain something to the reader, that is very, very difficult to do because it ends up feeling very contrived and very stilted. So as we're going through and I'm giving all the limits of epistolary work, I'm going to go back on a lot of them because I think Virginia Evans does a very good job of like avoiding a bunch of these pitfalls. So it's really very limited in lots of different ways. There are a couple of examples of very famous books, and people point to them as epistolary novels, but they do kind of like a shortcut thing. So, for example, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has there are letters that are kind of the frame of the thing, but they kind of fall away. So if you have letters in there, but you also then have a like the majority of the book is just narrated by a third person narrator, then that is not like a true epistolary novel. The Color Purple, a lot of people don't remember this. That is a book that is epistolary, but in it we have Cece, she's writing letters to her sister, and that is certainly epistolary, but she's also writing letters to God. So if you have something, I mean, obviously if you're writing a letter to God, you can say whatever you want. I don't know, that's like my agnostic kind of feeling about irreverence. But my sense is that, it can be obviously very confessional, which is a very good thing about an epistolary novel. It can be angry, it can be accusatory, but you would have a lot of breadth if you are writing to God. It's much less constrained than if you're writing like to one person who is your lover, for example, which we have in Dangerous Liaisons. You also have epistolary novels that are like there'll be a bunch of journal entries. There's some sort of like wider expanse that allows for a different kind of understanding. Also, with letters, it's very hard. There's a lot of connective tissue that we need in a novel for it to feel really fulfilling, and it's very difficult sometimes to give enough connective tissue. We also, if you want like a scene, if you want something that's like very visually developed, and you have someone who's writing a letter, like maybe there's someone who just like waxes, verbose and just like goes crazy and just is like really like describing a whole scene, but often that also feels contrived. So it's difficult in the sense that the ability to have scenes is kind of limiting. Okay, but so I want to talk now about all of the different ways that Virginia Evans is besting the limitations of the epistolary novel. So first and foremost, I think, is the idea that you have lots of different voices here. This is not like Dangerous Liaisons where you just have letters back and forth between two people. The fact of having all of those different voices allows all sorts of good things to happen. There is a ton of plot. We're going to look at that in just a second. But we have all of these different voices who are all developing different things. Of course, Sybil is the hub, which keeps us kind of organized and grounded, which is excellent. But there is a lot going on. In fact, when we get to the quibbles, I will say that sometimes it feels like there's a little too much going on. And also, importantly, Virginia Evans is very good at this thing where she does things very economically. So sometimes, I just was arguing that it's hard to like have a big whole scene of something, but there is something about the nature of Sybil Van Antwerp, because she's kind of no nonsense. There is this way that she will describe something, and often it's after the fact, and she'll describe it in a way that is very economical and very kind of terse, and it feels organic in her voice, and it is satisfying. So Virginia Evans is taking this thing of like not being able to describe big scenes, and she's really using it to her benefit because it ends up feeling very economical. I kind of felt like when I was reading this, like if you have good friends and you're interested to like hear, I don't know, like how their brothers and sisters are, you kind of want like a quick update, but you don't need like a whole big like backstory, and you don't need things put in scene. And you can have these very like satisfying facts that are given to you. Some of it felt like that. Like I was like, oh my gosh, okay, good to hear again about Harry Landy and how he's doing over the years. But I don't really necessarily need like lots and lots of scene where we have Harry Landy, struggling through adolescence, which, wow, adolescence was not easy for Harry. The other thing that Evans does that is really good and takes advantage of the epistolary novel is that obviously these things are first person. So any letter that someone sits down and writes is going to be in the first person. And one advantage of the first person is that it's very given to confessional style. And there's some really great parts in here. I mean, there are letters from Sybil to her ex-husband. There are a whole bunch of examples of this where people are very confessional. They're saying something that's deep and that's important and that's difficult for them to say, and they're kind of working it out on the page. That can be very, very beautiful, this idea of the confessional mode. We also really sometimes have like a real accusatory thing that works very well. There are actually quite a few parts like this. The example that's popping into mind is a conflict. I'm not going to spoil anything for anyone, but a conflict that Sybil is having with her best friend Rosalie about her daughter Fiona. And there is a way that Sybil is like voicing her anger and her accusations that is so satisfying. Like it is not a dialogue, which is kind of obvious when you see it like that, but like she's able to just like give full breadth of like her anger about the situation with Rosalie, and it's very satisfying because you have this sense of like the accusatory nature of this being really like delved into and kind of neatly encapsulated in a way that is so satisfying. I also, this is out of order, I had this further down, but I'm going to mention it right now. I thought it was so genius that we had the like childhood letters between Sybil and Rosalie. I thought that was so well done. One of the big challenges of the epistolary novel is to talk about the past and the future without it being like really heavy-handed. You can't be like, hey, Dan, if you're Sybil, like, hey, Dan, my ex-husband now, remember that time that blah, blah, blah. I mean, there is a little bit of that, and sometimes actually it did feel a little heavy-handed or contrived. But I don't think it was contrived because of the epistolary thing. I just think it was, it was information that she needed to get across that would have been difficult in any sort of structure. But I really loved those childhood letters, not only because it gave us some of the backstory of Sybil, we understand her a little bit better, and like some of the tragedies in her early life that go on and color all of her life. It's not just the loss of her child, which is a problem. The other thing that this epistolary structure does so well is it really ramps up the tension. So I mentioned that, we have these things are very episodic. And Virginia Evans made this very interesting point that this structure is a little forgiving because you can kind of move around these letters and you can change the dates in a way that they're discrete, so you can have them and have a response to them. And it's much easier than having to like rewrite entire big sections of a novel that's being written, in scene. But what happens when you have like a little gap, we'll be hearing about Harry Landy, or we'll hear about Fiona, or we'll hear about Dan. And then we'll have, a bunch of other stuff that's happening. And you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, what did happen with Felix and that big crisis that he has? I loved Felix. Felix as a character was so good. But I want to just really quickly zip through this list of all of these different plot points that are happening. One of the big issues with epistolary novel is it's very hard to generate a lot of plot without it feeling contrived. And this did not feel contrived. And if anything, I thought there was a little too much plot happening. So we have the question in the beginning of Felix and Sybil and their adoption, and we have some questions about that go on to be important things. But we also have this question of Felix and his partner Stuart. We have the question of Sybil and whether or not she's going to travel. She's adamant at the beginning that she won't go to France to visit him. We have, in terms of their adoption, we have this question of Sybil and whether or not she wants to find out her DNA and what that is going to unleash, which is a whole thing. We have this question of Fiona, who clearly is distanced from her mother, and we're wondering why, and we're wondering, is this a relationship that's going to become stronger over time? We have Bruce. Bruce we hear a little bit less about. Bruce is a little bit less interesting to me. Also, the name Bruce, oh my God, that is not a name I love. It's like the name Doug. I'm sorry if you're listening and your name is Bruce or Doug. To me, they seem just a little older names. But so we have Fiona and Bruce. They're very Irish. Or maybe Bruce is Scottish. I don't know. I can't remember. But I'm going to, again, chalk this up to the fact that we had Virginia Evans up in Ireland for a lot of the time when this was happening. But back to the plot points, we have Dan and his wife Lena. We have the idea of Sybil and Rosalie, what is going to happen there. They actually do have, a lot of plot is happening. We have Sybil and Bassam, who's the customer service representative at Kindred at the DNA place. And there's a lot happening with Bassam that's very interesting. He was a very compelling character, even though we only saw very, brief sketches of him. We have this idea of Rosalie, who happens to be married to Lars, who is Dan's brother, which this whole thing is sounding very convoluted. And it is a little convenient that we have Rosalie and Sybil, who are childhood friends, and they happen to marry brothers. That didn't bother me that much. I mean, sometimes I think there are these, convenient things that happen, and it is very important that we have a connection, that keeps us somehow connected with her ex-husband, but I'm not sure it was totally necessary. I really liked the character of Rosalie, and she was complicated where Fiona, the daughter, is concerned. But we also have this question of how Rosalie is doing with her husband, Lars, who has some sort of neurodegenerative disease. And then also she has a son who has special needs. So Rosalie, there's some questions about how life is going to unfold for her. We, of course, have the question of Sybil and her neighbor, Theodore. We also have the question of Theodore and what his whole life is about. And that to me, I wasn't totally sure we needed that. There was a very kind of deep kind of thing that happens with him that has, I think, the potential for a lot of gravitas. To me, I don't know, it felt just not quite earned, but certainly is a big plot point. We have the question of Sybil and Mick. Both of these men are her age, and both of them are interested in her. It's kind of nice that we have this rivalry happening. And I think a lot of people would argue that this idea of love interests toward the end of her life balance out the idea of mortality. That is not quite what happened for me. In terms of plot, though, we have Harry Landy and what's going to happen with him. Also the question of Harry Landy's mother and father. All of these families have lots of drama going on. And I think she does a good job of it. But there is, again, lots and lots of plot happening here. I have in my notes Joan, Anne, Larry, and I'm like, who the hell are Joan, Anne, and Larry? I'm looking at this for so long, and I'm like, who are these characters? Joan Didion, Anne Patchett, and Larry McMurtry. So, we don't have a lot of drama with those guys, but we have some very meaningful letters. And that, of course, writing to these authors is a big part of what is going on. Again, I'm not totally sure that I believe in like the correspondence that these people are writing back and forth a lot. I do know that Virginia Evans had that kind of correspondence with Anne Patchett, which I think is unusual. And it kind of doesn't matter whether it's realistic or not. I kind of like didn't quite buy it. There's a thing in literature where, someone else can like think that's totally fine and that's great for them. But like if I didn't totally buy it, then I have to argue that it is not successful. So we, of course, have this idea of like what is happening in their lives. There's some allusion to the fact that Joan has lost a child and Joan has lost a husband. So there's some really nice parallels going there. And so we do have a sense of those characters as having plot, like kind of contributing to the plot. We also, of course, have the question of blindness. We know from the beginning that Sybil's eyesight is failing. We're like, oh my God, what is going to happen? How is this going to play out? And then, of course, there is the question of like how, she's older and I actually can't remember what age she is, which is interesting. I'm thinking like mid to late 70s. It surprises me that I don't know because I'm thinking a lot about ages and like the 70s versus the 80s and, at what point people really start to decline. I wanted her to be like in her late 80s, which I'm not, again, I think it's kind of strange and probably good that I don't know exactly how old she is. That's not something that was hammered in. But, she's definitely older. And so there is this question of mortality. So just in terms of wrapping up, there is so much plot that is happening here. At times, oh my God, I didn't even mention the whole thing about the son of Italian immigrants who is avenging his father, and I'm not going to tell you what happens with that, but that is a major plot point. And that was one, I liked the kind of resolution of it, and I liked her explanation, Sybil's explanation, and how she handled it. I thought that was good. Again, there was part of me that was like, wow, we are tackling the autism spectrum with Harry, and we're talking immigration with Bassam, and we're talking about the Second World War, and we're talking about infertility, and we're talking about neurodegenerative diseases, and we're talking about living in Europe versus living in the United States. There's so much going on here that I wasn't totally sure that we needed this whole, it felt like maybe slightly melodramatic, which is actually the perfect segue into my experience of the audiobook. So as I mentioned before, I tend to toggle back and forth between a physical book and the audiobook. And I am not a fan of the like more heavily produced audiobook. I don't really love it when they add music. I don't really love it when the voices toggle back and forth. I'm listening right now to Wuthering Heights, and it's read by, what is her name? I want to say Dimsdale. Probably not Dimsdale because that came from the Scarlet Letter. But she was in Downton Abbey. She's maybe Anna, maybe is her name in Downton Abbey. Anyway, her voice is great. And I was just this morning admiring how when she goes back and forth in dialogue between Heathcliff's voice and Kathy's voice, it's just good. And it's obviously a woman who is speaking as Heathcliff, and she's not like trying to like be like, hey, it's not like that. But it's well done. And I'm like, this is the way I like the audiobook. These days, there's a lot of like production and we have lots of different actors. So a couple of things on that. One is that I did not love it. I loved Theodore's accent. I thought that was amazing. I loved him as a character. I loved everything about the audiobook version of him. But like the guy who's avenging his father's death, to me, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel like this accent is just like kind of put on. And I was like, wait, was this guy born in the United States? Like how much of this accent is feeling kind of heavy-handed? I was very distracted by a few of the voices. Most importantly, I did not love the voice of Sybil. Sybil in the book is prickly in the beginning. Gilbert Cruz from the New York Times Book Review, he at one point called her cantankerous, and I was like, yes, she is cantankerous. So she is someone who's prickly. She's meant to be prickly. She's meant to be formal. But my version of her in my head was much more generous than the voice of the woman who read it. I found her, there was something about the voice of Sybil that made her seem much more formal and more distant and more prickly and cantankerous. And overall, Sybil was not a character that I ended up liking very much. I do not need to like a character in order to love a book. That is not at all a requirement. But there was something about her that left me like unsympathetic in a way that was actually like, that's one of my quibbles that we're about to get to. But I do think that part of that was when I heard the audio voice, when the audio actor was giving voice to Sybil, that did not do any favors. It was not adding to my appreciation of Sybil over time. Along those lines, when you have a letter from someone, part of the delight is like their handwriting and the pen color and the paper that they've written it on. I am not a huge fan of like changing fonts and changing formats and like, obviously, if this is an epistolary book, you're going to have the date, and I guess you'll have the address. I kind of liked the address. I liked that, it told us how far apart, Theodore's house was from Sybil's. There were a couple of things like that I liked. But generally, like the email stuff back and forth, like for some reason, that kind of stuff ends up feeling kind of gimmicky to me. And that was the case here, like the changing of the fonts. It just, there was part of me that's like, I just don't think that this was necessary. It made it feel like a little too light, which I think is probably not the experience of most people. And I like the idea of like trying like a nod toward the idea of letters as like, as artifacts, like letters as vestiges of someone's, like being. But the font changes didn't quite do it for me. So we're going to close here. I'm just going to rush through just one or two quibbles that I had, and then just quickly touch on the appeal of this book. So one of the things is just contrivance. There were one or two, like whenever an author uses a line that's like, it's hard to believe, or you're not going to believe this, you have to kind of buckle up and be like, okay, are you doing that because you know that this is not quite earned in the sense of the novel? And that happened when Sybil checks the box when she's doing the kindred application thing. And she says later that it's because she was drunk and she was angry or something. And I was like, I don't buy it. I don't. This like, it just didn't all kind of hang together for me. There also was, like, to me, it felt a bit contrived that when we have this character, her name is Henrietta. I'm not going to discuss who she is, but it turns out that Henrietta is a botanist and knows a lot about a genetics. And this is a vein that has to do with DNA in the book. And it just seemed a little bit too convenient to me that this woman happened to be an authority on botany and genetics. I also, unfortunately, I didn't totally buy the character of Mick and Sybil. I just didn't really get their chemistry ever. I liked the idea of like these rivalries, but there was one point when Mick, or I guess it's Sybil, she's like, she's maybe like writing to her brother or something, but she's like, I don't know why he's not looking for a younger woman. And part of me is like, wait, yeah, why is he not looking for a younger woman? Unfortunately, part of me was like, wow, it does seem like a tiny bit unusual. I will not say impossible, but a little bit unusual that he is dating someone who is actually his age, which, I mean, that's terrible for me to say, but honestly, like, I do not have a lot of examples of much older men, like in their 80s who are, really going after other women in their 80s, which is unfortunate, but that is my experience. I also think that because, Sybil at one point mentions that, it's like, I think that we have this acknowledgement on the part of the author, like this seems maybe like a little bit far-fetched, and it might be, I think for most people, that probably was not an issue, but that was a very small point where I was like, I'm not fully understanding, like why he is so into this woman who is prickly and formal, and like, who knows, but that was a piece that didn't work quite as well as the rest of the book. I also mentioned earlier, in fact, my only other quibble is really the fact that there's like a little too much going on for me. I just felt like we didn't need all of these different storylines. And that, in retrospect, like I feel very kind of satisfied by the whole thing. There's just a couple of storylines that I felt like we could have eliminated and the whole thing would have still flowed just as beautifully as it does. So we're going to end with just a quick note on the appeal. So one of the things that we have, as a country and as like humans right now, we have, I think, this real question of how it is we're going to connect to each other and how we are going to communicate. And this to me was a really good example of ways that people are communicating in kind of like unlikely relationships and in unlikely ways. And it's really this beautiful example of how humans can really, reveal themselves and can express very important, very poignant, very deep emotions in ways that are very effective during a historical moment when people are having a very, very hard time communicating effectively with anyone. I also, of course, was a big fan of the fact that this entire thing is built of language, which that's a very obvious thing. It's a novel. Obviously, it is made of words. But this idea that people can have, through the written word, that they can have this kind of communion, this kind of correspondence, it was very meaningful for me. I also think that it's very satisfying. When Virginia Evans was talking to Gilbert Cruz, at one point she was talking about the idea of a 360 view of someone's life, and I don't that's not something that I tend to love in a book. And sometimes I was a little frustrated by how much time we were attempting to cover. I sometimes I definitely like that. I like to sort of dilate one small moment and have that be like a focus instead of having it be over a long breadth of time. But I think for a lot of people, it's very satisfying to have like the whole breadth of someone's life be kind of contained in a way that does feel very satisfying. I also think that just as an example of an older woman who is by herself and who is independent and who is strong and who has had a career and who's being upfront about, the choices that she has made, all of that was inspirational. I think there were parts about her, like as an older woman, that I found not easy to read because I was like, ugh, I don't want to feel any of these things that she's feeling. But I will fully admit that by the end of the book, there is a lot of hope. This is a book that is full of hope. That seems like a good note to end on. So thank you very much for tuning in. And I hope that this deepened your appreciation for this incredible runaway success that really, I think, deserves all of the readers that it has had. So thank you for tuning in. Happy reading.